Good morning, everyone. I was despairing that this 8:30 session might not fetch a sufficient number of audience, for me to begin. And I was discussing with my friend, Colonel Avinash Singh ji, whether a breakfast, a gala breakfast probably, in one of the halls might not be a better alternative. But thank you so much for coming. And of course, my talk is nowhere close to what happened yesterday. It's just a small uh, attempt at a discussion, probably a conversation, something to share with you. And thank you, Smriti, for the introduction. But what I would also like to tell you, just for information, is that I am a historian and I work on Central India. My areas of focus are the history of tribal peoples, state formations. I also dabble a little in the philosophy of history and anthropological history. There's a book that I've authored that was released a few years back, during COVID actually, in 2021 by Taylor and Francis Routledge, London. It's called Kings, Spirits, and Memory in Central India, Enchanting the State. That is one of the many publications that I have that deal with all these topics that I have mentioned. So in case you're interested in those things, then please do have a look at them. I could direct you to them, after the conference. This is not really my field of specialization or of abiding sort of academic interest. I was roped into this talk by a couple of people who I must thank. One of them is Colonel Avinash Singh, who is the principal of Rajkumar College where I studied and whose governing body I still am part of. And this is, in fact, something that I'm doing, for them as a representative of that college. And that's how I fit into this, conference. Otherwise, St. Stephen's College and Delhi University, as I was discussing with my friends Arvind Vepa and Davina, seem to be as far from these things as possible when they actually need to very much be dealing with these kinds of concerns and doing these kinds of things for themselves as well. But until such time as that happens, perhaps we will have to try and interlope into these kinds of conferences and pose as representatives of other institutions that fit in better. So here I am as part of a small delegation from Rajkumar College, Raipur, which is a small well, it's not a small school. It's actually a fairly large school and a very old school, and an important one in Central India because it's one of the oldest public schools in the original sense in which the word public school was used, because one of our principals, Smith Pierce, in the 1920s was one of the founding persons for the Indian Public Schools Conference. And that conference was very exclusive at that time. It comprised mostly schools that were meant to tutor and train princes from various parts of India to take up administrative positions later in their specific sort of kingdoms and feudatory sort of areas. And Rajkumar College was one such, dealing with the princes of the eastern states agencies in Orissa, Chhattisgarh, what is present-day Orissa, Chhattisgarh, West Bengal, and the larger Bengal area, which includes Assam and other such places. And it is, however, less known, especially because our focus seems to be so much North Indian, and which is why some of us like Rajkumar College and Hyderabad Public School, and I was telling Colonel Avinash that we are the two oldest public schools in the Deccan. So let's try and create a Deccan-y kind of interest with a sufficiently important sounding name, also historically sort of well-known, Deccan. And that might sort of bring a little bit of interest among mostly North Indian focus. So I'm so glad that this is happening in the Deccan. So that's one. The other thing is that since I'm now here with you, I thought I'd share something that Mr. Ganesh Kohli, found of some interest when he was in Raipur at Rajkumar College, where we were partnering with IC3 in hosting their regional outreach. This is the first time that IC3 actually moved to central India, and they wanted some contact with schools in Chhattisgarh, and Rajkumar College was there to help and host IC3. So I'm grateful to Mr. Kohli as well. I would like to thank Varsha, who's followed my subsequent sort of contact about this talk, mostly on email, and helped set this up, in general, and also Smriti, who's here to, conduct the session. I must confess that there were a very large number of emails that I got from IC3 until such time as I was forced to write to Varsha to plead with her not to send any more emails, because professors generally tend to be very scattered, and a large number of emails further complicate matters. So I said this would be too much, St. Stephen's will probably throw me out if I kind of, pretended that I was in an IC3, conference room or exhibition instead of a lecture class, which is what I was very much in the danger of doing with this deluge of emails. So, but anyway, thank you so much to Varsha and to you for that. So to come to the topic of my talk, which is what Mr. Kohli found interesting and thought might be useful to us here at the IC3 conference, annual conference this at Hyderabad, is about the past, present, future of counseling. And I will hope to provide a historical perspective. As you can see, this is something that cannot be covered within the scope of 30 minutes or even an hour, or probably one or two conferences. It might take a lifetime to sort of, know about and then, of course, talk about. So I will just sort of tease you or provoke you into a kind of thought, and then perhaps one can think of this further. And this is coming from the fact that educational and vocational counseling has become very important. And the IC3 annual conference and the size, and I was really amazed at the number of people who are here and the kinds of activities that are going on, is testimony to the fact that this is very important. And also to the fact that everything is not yet settled here, which is why all these discussions, sorry, that's my phone, which I have failed to silence, so pardon. So the IC3 conference and the buzz that is here is, testimony to the fact not only of the importance of educational and vocational counseling, but also the fact that a lot of things still need to be discussed. So questions, very basic questions like, when do we begin counseling? Who do we counsel? What do we sort of counsel them about? Should we focus more on a particular sort of future goal towards which we must orient our victim, the student, or should we try and provide what is now being discussed as a holistic sort of understanding of the range of things available to young people at this time? Should we prepare them for the market so that they can get the best jobs as they go out there and struggle for their futures? Or should we teach them how to live good humanist lives, of leisure, where they cultivate gardening or music or theater and other such things? Is there a balance? And where is, in fact, the balancing bar? These are only a few of the things that, are, in fact, holding the attention of a lot of people here, from what I could see from the titles of the sessions that are being conducted here. So clearly it is a matter that has not yet been settled. My argument is that in order to be able to answer these questions, and we might not be able to get the correct answer. In fact, in order to be able to grapple with these questions a little more meaningfully, it is perhaps important for us to look at the history of education and of educational and vocational counseling. That is where I'm sort of coming from. And this is the line of causation that I'm following, which is that educational and vocational counselings are not things that are floating around in the air that we can catch and attend to at will. These are embedded in societies and in social formations. So when I say societies, I mean not just society as in sociologically societies, but also their economies, their polities, their cultures, their religious lives, etc. So the totality of all of this, which is a social formation. So a certain kind of society then requires a certain kind of education, and then that education is meant to provide a certain direction to where students are going. So that is the line of causation that I want to follow. So what then I want to argue from there is that unless we know how society has changed and what its educational and vocational requirements are, we will not be able to understand where we are coming from, what is the juncture at which we are, and where we are going, right? So that is the point. If at any point you feel that I'm saying things that are tangential or off the mark, please interrupt me. And if you think I'm also obfuscating, which historians often do, please catch me at that as well. I'll be very happy. Now, I think modern education began when modern society came into being. And this is the 14th and the 15th centuries in Europe specifically. So the word modern etymologically means here and now, but we use the word modern more commonly to denote a certain kind of orientation. So if someone is wearing a munda or a dhoti, he is not modern, although he might be existing right in the midst of us. But if you wear a suit, then we are modern. So I mean in that sense of modern. So modern society takes birth in Europe in the 14th and the 15th centuries. And that is where modern education begins. Before this, there was very little education. There were these seminaries that mostly gave religious and theological education. Most other people were supposed to just learn within family systems, local and intimate tutorships, and so on and so forth. And that is because the demands of society, the educational, vocational demands of society were fixed. So George Duby writes this book called The Three Orders, in which he talks about how European society was divided into three social groups, each of whose stations were supposed to be maintained by whatever there was in terms of educational and vocational efforts at that time. And these were the fighters, the knights, the people who prayed, the priests, and the people who toiled on the soil, the laborers. The people who were the serfs in Europe at this time. So your station was given to you. You were not supposed to find meaning and a new sort of direction and the best possible future, etc. It was set. If you were born within one of these orders, you were supposed to stay within that order, right? So there's no need for any counseling. There was no counseling that was required in a society, a tradition-based hierarchical society like this. Right, so this is what is often referred to as the feudal period in Europe. And in the feudal period, there was no requirement for educational or vocational counseling. But in the 15th century, this began to break up. And feudal society began to give way to something called the capitalist society. And I'll come to that in a while. Now, capitalism is an interesting thing. It is wonderful at one level, and it is very frustrating at another. At once, it holds the promise of freedom, and at the same time, it curtails it. I'll quickly bring that out to you, and that is what is the heart, or at the heart, of the problems that we are asking ourselves to resolve or to attend to today in sort of counseling, vocational, or education. Now, capitalism, there are many discussions about how capitalism began or what it is. But what it definitely is is a more commercial sort of society in which there is trade, there is commerce, there is industrial expansion and production, there is other kinds of things that are related to it. It is a far more dynamic society, especially one that is based on markets in relation to feudalism, where essentially the economy was very autarkic and based largely on the feudal domains of the European lords. This is a worldwide system that connects all parts of the world in relationships of commerce and trade and other related things, right? All societies before capitalism were societies with markets. In capitalism, something interesting happens, and that is that for the first time, you have a market society, a society driven primarily by market considerations. The principles of market are what now become the governing principles for the social formation as a whole. You might argue with this, but religion, culture, society, polity, economy, everything becomes essentially something that is now driven by the principles of market. Now, what happens is that in capitalism, a specific type of economic conjuncture appears in which human beings get separated from, right? And this is important, human beings get separated from all other factors of production to such an extent that they themselves become a factor of production, meaning that human beings also get commodified. Everything is being commodified. Politics, we see the commodification of politics today, the marketing of politics, the monetization of politics, the bureaucracy. These are processes of the same ilk, which are happening in India now, which happened in Europe in the 15th, 16th, 17th century. Historians are used to dealing with the longue durée, where you not just look at 10 years or 20 years or 50 years, but often centuries. So there's a caveat here that I'm probably simplifying a lot of things, but please bear with me there. So what happens here is this commercialization of society is something that also ends up commercializing human beings or commodifying human beings. And this is absolutely important for the conundrums that we face today in counseling and in, educational and vocational sort of counseling. There are a lot of books that are available, many discussions. If you're interested, I could direct them to you. I've listed a few here. The important consideration is commerce and profit. Those are the defining things. What happens then is that education, this is the kind of society that we're talking about, capitalist society. Education then needs to be directed towards making possible the most optimum utilization of labor within the economy. How do you use labor best to be able to achieve the greatest amount of profit? Right? There's a very specific development that first happens in England that actually achieves this, where humans are completely isolated and separated from all other factors of production. And then once this model of economy sort of comes into being, it is so efficient and profit sort of directed that it outcompetes all other possible models of economic life and existence anywhere in the world. There are also other books that deal about this. For example, Hobsbawm's, the very well-known historian Hobsbawm's work, Customs in Common, which looks at how this model of commercialization outcompetes all other existing models of the economy, right? And that then gradually spreads from England to the rest of Europe. And as the world becomes one large economic space through the expansion of Europe, or what is called colonialism, then that logic is carried to other parts of the world as well, right? But the important thing there to note is that human beings become basically, become sort of cogs in a certain system. That leads to, in terms of human experience, what is referred to as alienation. And this is something that you must be experiencing in your students when you see some of them now, because this process is now falling upon us and bearing down upon us in a way that it hasn't before. That's because capitalism is coming properly to India, all of South Asia, a large part of the global South, only now in the late 20th and the 21st centuries. So this happens in Europe, of course, 300, 400 before that. It comes to India in the period of colonialism, but properly only from the 19th century onwards. As Britain comes into India and links India to its commercial networks across the world, India gradually begins to become part of this big system of commerce, profit-making, commodification, etc., etc. However, it is only after 1857 that India is properly integrated into the British system. It is only when the English crown takes control of India that all the other ways in which this linkage is completed actually begin, which is, say, for example, the expansion of railways. The railways then connect the smallest and the most isolated parts of India, forest areas and so on and so forth, to the world economy. So what is being, the forests that are being cut in central India, the very dense and largely isolated areas of central India, find their way through the railways into the British system and then the global system to be able to then supply, say, rafters to British ships, British Navy, who are fighting the Germans, or whatever. I mean, there are all kinds of ways in which India is then, in fact, put into more and more, squeezed into this world system. And then this world system begins to operate more fully in the case of India. Now, while this is happening, there's also another thing happening, and that gives us hope. That capitalism is at once, as I was telling you, something that both provides freedom because it breaks feudal order, for example, as I pointed out earlier, and frees human beings for doing other things, but it simultaneously also frees them of property. So they have no property of their own. They become laborers themselves. They are commodified. So there is a double move here within the world of capital. At once, it commodifies you, but it also provides the promise of a more general and profound freedom, right? And I think the history of capital has subsequently always been a history of a struggle between these two aspects. There's one aspect that will seek to further and further commercialize and commodify, and simultaneously it will also provide you a sense of how this is happening, so that in your alienation, you want, in fact, to escape that alienation. So that alienation, that experience of alienation is an experience that is a contradiction in terms, actually. It is something that is produced by this commodification, but also necessarily because of that commodification, alienation, seeks an exit out of that condition or circumstance, right? So that I choose to call sentience, the capacity to feel. So as human beings become commodities, can they retain that human element of wanting to feel, or the capacity to feel, right? That is absolutely important. And that is what, in fact, works against this commercialization. So always there will be this choice of, should we direct our students towards the market, or should we direct them towards society, towards public good? These often are irreconcilable. Sometimes they can be reconciled. These are not absolutely stark choices all the time. So, for example, Bill Gates does both with equal finesse. You know, he has a lot of money, but he also, supports the biggest charities in the world. But you can do that only when you come to a certain point. For most of us in the world, this choice is really not available. It is always a struggle. Should we teach a student who's coming from a middle class and lower middle class background, should we teach that student the skills to be able to get a proper job in the market that will solve his or resolve his needs for the moment? But in doing so, are we not sort of giving him up to the system as it is? Should we cultivate within him that sentience that he has experienced, but from which he wants to escape? Because it hasn't got him food and the basics of livelihood. Or should we cultivate in him this other sort of aspect, the humanities, really, in some senses? So it's coming from there. And that has to do with this double nature of capitalism, the promise of freedom, but the frustration of the embedding of human beings within a world system determined essentially by markets. We see a large number of systemic efforts being made against the marketization, the commercialization of human beings, of society, etc. Social democracy, which is a political system within Western Europe, is one example of it. Sometimes it gets called the welfare state in other parts of the world, like, for example, in India, but it is the same thing. Human rights is an important pointer to the fact that we are interested in other things as well. The Human Development Index is something that focuses on things like health and education, whereas the capitalist system will try and commercialize these as well. We sometimes step back and want to or need to think of these things as things that need not be or should be protected from the market. Happiness index is again one of those things that has come up, which tries to take away focus towards something else that is considered important, and so on and so forth. In the world of educational and vocational counseling, we are confronted with these imperatives, which represent the various tensions within capitalism, the contradictions within capitalism every day. And that is what we have to resolve. But we need to know where we are coming from and where we might be going. India, South Asia, and the rest of the world is probably going to become more and more capitalist. So whether we want it or not, there will be need, there will be a demand for focus on things that sometimes counselors feel need not be prioritized to the extent that they are, because then the whole system is about creating people who fit into this mad rush to commercialize and to enter the market and to profit from it, and so on and so forth. So where do we draw the line? How do we find the balance? Right? That is the thing that is important. So sentience is something that must always, I feel, lie at the heart of educational and vocational counseling, and keeping that element of human nature intact is very important as we go further. And this has to do with some of the very basic discussions about what is human nature. So as you know, there are two important points of view, one represented by thinkers like Hobbes, who writes the Leviathan, who believes that human beings are essentially greed-driven, and they will try and achieve the maximum for themselves, even at the cost of social relations. And others, represented by the other point of view, represented by someone like John Locke, who writes the two treatises of government and other documents that are important for the English Revolution, where he argues that human beings are essentially public motivated, they are socially sort of oriented, and they will first want to seek, or essentially, or eventually at least, want to seek social communities rather than self-preservation and self-interest. So of course, the choice is not always either this or that, but these are two important things that mark the bigger philosophical discussion. And somewhere it dovetails into the story about the beginnings of counseling and education within a certain social formational context, and where it is leading us and where we are, in fact, in terms of that. And of course, what is to come in the future. So with that, I will stop and see if you have any questions you would want me to answer. Thank you. Thank you. So this is the very efficient IC3 sort of this where you have a Q&A thing as well. So yeah.
Good morning. I just wanted to know, like, the overall session, can we have a, like, industrial psychology should be involved over here? Because industrial psychology is all about,
Industrial psychology.
yeah. So it's all about taking care of markets, how we can improve our market, how we can improve our economy. So this is what somewhere connected, right? So should we
Right.
involve that in our syllabus? Will that improve the historical perspective and the psychological perspective, not just taking care of labors over here?
So that is, I think, what you will be expected to do, because that is the demand.
Yeah,
See, the market works through the principle of demand and supply.
correct.
So you will be required to give your students information about these things to be able to counsel them way so that you keep
The
sort of,
balance.
moderating
Yeah.
the impact, the harshness of that market imperative.
Yes.
I think that
Yeah.
will be.
So like that's a coming future also, we can say.
Yes. I think this is what is being said throughout
Yeah.
in all the talks
Hmm.
and this idea is being is center stage as to how do we ameliorate, how do we. Yes, please. Ma'am.
Yeah, thank you.
Actually, I'm just trying to connect a few dots.
Right.
So if I understood everything correct, it's got a lot to do with the dehumanization. That's what you spoke, which was essential at one time. And it came into the educational system completely. You're probably talking about the Industrial Revolution. Obviously, that's when it actually came in. And even our classrooms are now, or now they aren't for all progressive schools, but otherwise they were lines and they were rows because that is what you actually needed in a factory system. So that's why our classrooms were designed that way. So anyways, that's another part. So that actually dehumanized education also. And that's what we are struggling. I think all counselors, all educators are struggling for that. So when we talk about the future of counseling, I guess that's an area of interest to all of us here. It's very natural now. And I'm also going to bring in the technology part and the AI discussion that we've been having everywhere, that if you want to exist today and be relevant, you need to get the humanistic touch or the feelings, what we spoke about, the sentience that you spoke about. So are we talking about, as a counselor, your children right now, in any case, by design, have been dehumanized in a way? And now it's really important for us to get the children into the humanistic part, to let them feel that there has to be humanization of them, the feelings. Only then will you be relevant in industry tomorrow, because with the advent of technology, if you don't have that, you will become irrelevant, try whatever you may. I don't know if I'm making sense.
Yes. Yes, I think that's one argument that a lot of us are taking now, which is that not only does the human aspect sort of, not only is it important for itself, but it also will leaven in some senses your, or in fact benefit you if you're wanting to play the market. It's important practically in terms of market requirements also, that say somebody coming for a discussion with you at a very high level of, say, corporate uh, life might be impressed by the human aspect that you show, rather than just sort of be talking about numbers and so on and so forth. There's just one caveat there, which is that I deliberately use the word sentience and not humanity, which I was thinking about, because I think sentience, this capacity to feel, we are now arguing, is perhaps also there in animals and in plants. And because the environmental crisis is going to be the single most important crisis in the days to come, we need to be attentive to that sort of possibility, because to some extent our conceit, our aggression is, as human beings, is the result of a very humanist sort of sense of the world, whereas we need to have a sentient sense of the world, that we've never looked at plants and animals as equal beings in the world. Now we are beginning to, or there are now books where people are exploring even the details of how plants respond to the larger question where we need to be attentive to environmental sort of concerns much more fundamentally than we have done before. So rather than use the word, so I use the word humanities, but not so much humane, human, or so sentient, perhaps, in that sense. So yes, in fact, this argument might be an important argument to make, which is that we need to be, the being sentient might actually give us an edge in the market, right? That we need to, but I think eventually the drive for profit is such, and deracinating sort of drive that it seems to just take away this sentient part of us. Eventually, you have to, perhaps you could balance it. Perhaps if we can achieve that balance between sentience and profit. But to me, they seem to be essentially two very different sort of values, quantities that are essentially fundamental, philosophically, existentially, sort of ontologically also very sort of different. And so, yeah, good luck to us. I think we need to bring that in, and how we can do that, especially with AI and all that. I am really very pessimistic and cynical. I hope that you're right.
And I
that
agree
we're
with
able
you.
to-
Sorry, I'm just butting in. I completely agree with you that profiteering, as she rightly said, it's so strong that it takes away the, again, I'm saying human, even I would say feelings, the sentient point that you brought up, because if that was not so, we wouldn't have been laying off. Google wouldn't have been laying off. Amazon overnight couldn't be sending you a mail and telling you you're out of job. That means my profit is more important than your existence.
Right.
So the feeling has gone somewhere. So I think that
Actually, ma'am, at the heart of this is actually that process that I didn't really detail, where what happens is that before capitalism, everybody owned some productive property, so that everyone was able to actually create one's food requirements, at least, or livelihood. If say worse came, that person would be able to at least be able to grow something for herself and so on and so forth. What capitalism did was to divest all the larger part of the population of England in the 16th century of property rights. There was massive expulsion of people from their properties. And these properties were then concentrated increasingly in the hands of these landlords, who were then enclosing it for commercial sheep farming or commercial grain cultivation. For that reason, for the first time, the larger population of England found itself without property. So that if in the worst situation, they were not able to produce their own food. When that happens, they became dependent upon he who had so the property to get their food. I'm coming to the basic, which is why I'm saying food all the time. It sounds a little crude, but that is how it was. So because of this compulsion of having to go to a capitalist who now controls all productive property to the extent that you do not have any productive property, so the only way you can get your livelihood is to work for that person, that this relationship of profit making actually emerges, where human beings are essentially commodified. And this person who will now then employ you will want to employ you at the least possible rate or cost in order to be able to compete with the other person who also is now struggling with the same imperative. So every capitalist has this necessary requirement to increase productivity and profits to a point where he outcompetes the other capitalists. So that imperative is very important. So the drive for profit is what really is in fact the fundamental drive within or driving principle within society. So that has never happened before. Yes, so you will have to there's no way in which so monopolies are actually in the logical conclusion to capitalist accumulation, profit accumulation, capital accumulation, whatever. That's much yes.
I just wanted to ask you at as a school principal, and if you take my previous service in the army is concerned, in both services, I have noticed one thing, that our social structure is now uh, your existence, like in a society, is measured by the amount of money or amount of clout, and clout directly comes from the kind of assets that you control. Uh, it is very apparent that a person may be given doing any amount of social service, but when that person comes in a gathering and a big industrialist comes in a gathering, nobody is interested in that social service person at all. So the first thing that is there is, as parents coming to us, sir, ये आपके यहाँ नीट की कोचिंग होती है कि नहीं होती है, जेई की होती है, because they are mainly interested in the commercialization of education where their kids can find avenues to make money. Nobody is interested in the social welfare aspect of the thing, and this is very alarming. What happens is that you start seeing that at 60, 70, 80, people start donating things because they realize that after accumulating something, they realize that it was just a mirage and nothing happened. So I don't know how we are going to address as educationists this particular phenomena, because it is like that deep state, this commercialization you mentioned when you spoke in the school about the only thing left is weaponization of education. I still remember that word. And that is also happening, if you see. So this is a very alarming phenomena. I don't know where we are going to go from here. It will be literally cutthroat after this, or it has already begun.
Yes.
So when you were talking about social welfare, the students tend to take up internships or volunteer in certain organizations, NGOs, only to build their profile. It's not that they wanted to do anything, but they wanted to add it to their profile, especially the universities abroad. But why are the schools or universities in India not encouraging to have that? Because we have human power. Human power is more here. We have lots of people, lots of students, and there is the need of this human power also there. So while foreign universities are expecting the students to do that, why are the universities in India and why are the schools in India not expecting them to do?
So, ma'am, that's the answer. So historically, that's where we are coming from. So if you're seeing what you're seeing, it's because there are larger forces at play. So lest we be just thinking that if we do our, if we understand counseling very well here, we can do our courses and so on and so forth, we will be somewhat sheltered from, we are wrong, because there are larger forces operating at the social formation level, at the world level, historical level, the longue durée and so on and so forth. And there are these inexorable marches of time that will necessarily confront us with these things. So we will not be able to fully understand what we are dealing with, really. So we need to know that this conference actually, we might feel happy within a kind of cocoon of our sort of conference where everything is happy, but we are actually at this stage of historical development where these are going to be questions that will not leave us. So, the only way out is to remember that there are.
For education policy, we do have a system of building the portfolios.
Right.
So the schools are being told to build the portfolios.
Now,
So I think when we build those portfolios, we can pitch in all those elements of community service and all those things. So that like the things that they do in the colleges later on or in higher education or for other universities, they can start doing it in the school itself.
Right. So historically, governments and states have had a rather checkered sort of history. And they have both been sort of the problem as well as the solution. A large number of free societies have wanted as little government as possible. And say the United States and other such societies work essentially on the principle that the least amount of government and governance is, is good for society. Whereas in our societies who are lagging behind, reasons for social justice, etc., require the intervention of the state through affirmative action and other such things. And so it becomes important. For example, women's issues to a large extent now are being pushed forward and institutionalized as social justice sort of requirements by the state through legislation, through policy, and so on and so forth. So the state is this double-edged kind of entity or phenomena. And I really don't know what to do with it. In my book, I have criticized the state round and fully. But I don't think they will realize, because there's no one person which is the state, which is the good thing about, although increasingly in countries like India and other places, the state is becoming more focused, and there is often a person or an entity which is far more concrete than we would like the state to be. But so government, I'm not sure. At the moment, in a large number of countries in the global south, the state is an organ of the implementation of the policy requirements that are important for the growth of capital. So even, policies like the NEP, which are couched in social welfare or human rights or other such ameliorative sort of concepts, essentially at the end of the day, strategies for mobilizing labor, human beings, to the optimum for the market. So that is something that one needs to remember.
So I was just going to add something to what you were saying, and you were speaking about the NEP and the profile. I think she rightly said that even we may all build profiles, but unless and until the profiles are of some use by universities to give admissions, those profiles are also a farce to a large extent. I'm talking generic, I'm not talking about specific schools. But what I wanted to add optimistically is that when we speak about the humanistic part, I'm still using that word. And when she mentioned about, of what use would it be? So I was just thinking that it's only us educators, finally, who can make a difference. And I'm going to give a very personal example. I'm talking about my institution, not personally me. I have seen children coming from hardcore business families where, again, it's profiteering, and that's what is the discussion at home also. So you grow up in that. When you come to school and your teachers, your organization is working about doing things differently, about service, about joining NGOs or what kind of work NGOs do. And children, after passing out from class 12, now that's the practical thing, after passing out from class 12, and I can give you number of such cases in my institution where children said that, we just wanted to be, connected with an NGO and make a difference. So I think this change is not going to come by the state, because the state has a different agenda altogether. It's only we educators who can do it in our institution. It just may be a speck as of now, just a speck, but I think it's growing. Children are thinking differently because schools are showing them good examples. So I'm an absolute optimist that keep going on that path, and there will be the sentient part that you were talking about. It will come in education. It's very slow. It may take years. Maybe I may not live to even see that, but it'll happen.
Yeah. Yeah, like sir was saying that at the age of 60, 70, 80, they think, what will they do with that money? Maybe they start doing that at an earlier age. Like God has been so good to me. Let me be good to others as well.
There's this other issue about authority, the government's making some kind of a legislation, policy, rule, regulation. And then one is making of that rule regulation, and the second part comes in the implementation. Now, what happens is, I'll take a very apt example of Right to Education Act. So they said that it's free and compulsory education for elementary, that means till age of 14. And it is the state's responsibility, that is the government's responsibility to provide this education. It kind of becomes like a fundamental right, so to say. Now, what happened was that within the same act, various provisions are given that the government within 3 years will create infrastructure to handle this part of the students who are not having access to the education. Till such time this infrastructure is created, 25% seats will be reserved in private educational institutions to accommodate these people. Fine. Now, what has happened is that everyone has forgotten about the government creating the infrastructure, because the rural India is still untouched by right to education. The students, you go, I mean, I don't have to tell you, you come from that area. You go to rural India, it is like hitherto, जैसे था वैसे था, अभी कोई change नहीं हुआ है. जो जैसे गांव वाला स्कूल था उसमें कुछ जाते हैं कुछ नहीं जाते हैं. Entire thing is focused on towns. कि बड़े स्कूल ने कितनी सीट दी हैं, पेपर में छपा, ये गरीब का बच्चा बड़े स्कूल में जाएगा, this and that. So the implementation of all these welfare-driven policies, these much to be desired at all levels. That means the government, I mean, we are all to blame. I mean, I'm not shirking away from the blame part of it, but somehow the mindset is so market-driven and profit-driven that this is just kind of become a lip service to that entire game of the overall game, that is to say. But that I'm being very cynical, but that's how I feel it is. As they say that cynic is a critic is a cynic who is a critic is an idealist who's a realist. So from that point of view.
Thank you. Yes, Kim.
Just a voice in the wilderness from this part of the room.
Yes.
Fascinating talk and equally fascinating discussion over here. And this war, this conflict between capitalism and sentient. I think everyone's searching for that sentient light at the end of the tunnel. What we saw yesterday, I think at the graduation, 200 global career counselors being graduated. Just thought if this course wasn't there, most of them would have probably become lawyers. Why lawyers? Because of crime. And crime is a product of capitalism. Counseling or sentience is the prevention of that, right? And therefore more counselors. What do you feel? Want to delve a bit into the future. We spoke about being totally sentient, and if one was a Mother Teresa and Abdul Kalam, you could be so, or a Bill Gates who has accumulated much in his life and at a certain point now wants to give back, or Michael Jackson for that matter. Does sentient come after a certain level of your self-actualization, whatever, in the Maslow's hierarchy over there? Okay. And has the world now evolved, like 16th century England compared to today, or even India compared to where we were? I think the global economy has increased the standard of living, where it'll be a little more globally more comfortable than we were before. And therefore, we can now think of being sentient. Bring it back into schools. Are we looking at a future where we can now look at becoming self-sentient, right? Once we have capitalism already in our pocket over there. How do you see what's next? Historically, how do we lead into the future?
So thank you so much, Kim, for that question. So there's a book by Thomas Piketty, I think it is called Capital in the 21st Century, where he looks at legacy inheritances within the capitalist system, where the Rockefellers of the world and the Gates and the sort of, now there'll be Musk and other people, Zuckerberg probably, if he has children, will pass on large concentrations of capital to their children, who will continue to patronize charities of a very high order, providing a cover really to the fact that this concentration has been achieved at the expense of basically a large number of injustices across various parts of the world and of the process at different levels and so on. So there are a large number of traditions within pre-capitalist communities, societies, times that point, for example, the sacred groves. The sacred groves are practiced by villages of what you would consider the most backward parts of India. A great example of sentience. And of, so, you know, the logic, the profit logic of capitalism tries to suggest that that's the best way in which one can live. But we're discovering now, we have discovered that probably not. At least not as far as environment is concerned. And that's going to be so, so big. And look at these sacred groves in isolated societies in Mizoram or, Kerala, where villagers maintain biodiversity, what would be called biodiversity hotspots in our language, as religious sort of ritual and practice. And both, get livelihoods as well as cultural, social, and other satisfactions that are sometimes supposed to be dependent only on profit. Unless you do this, how will you enjoy? You will not be able to go to Bali or something, some such. So one example is the sacred groves of, so in non-capitalist and pre-modern and southern, probably also in European, I must say for 15th and the 16th century are periods of great crisis in Europe because various kinds of systems are jostling for existence, and it is the capitalist logic that outcompetes everything in terms of this. So how do we not let this logic become so important to us, central to, critical to our ways of thinking and organizing our lives? We have a large number of examples. Communities or ways of living in communities are again one example in relation to atomized, isolated existences in box-like apartments in New York or somewhere, and so on and so forth. So, the idea of community. Religion offers a large number. Religion has been now vilified, the capitalists, of course, rubbish religion in their practice. And the critics of capital like Marx rubbish religion in their ideological conceptions of things like that. Religion offers, there's a lot to take from that. So many ways of living that are sentient. So I think we have to go back to these traditions, and there are answers there. Gandhi, for example, tried to imagine such a society where there would be, but one of his best sort of writings is the criticism of railways. So it's like saying that computers are bad today. Who would accept it? But so somehow thinking about or imagining something else seems to be abnormal. When did we become this? That's the important part we should ask. When did we begin thinking of these things as being abnormal? They're not. Sometimes they will say, so what is the alternative? So that is the poverty of imagination. Not just because it is really, pessimistic not be able to imagine something that will not happen, but also because you're not looking at the treasure of traditions in various societies and communities, and now dismissed as backward or religious or this or that, where there is actually example of how we've already lived like that and have been living for years. So perhaps, so the future lies in the past, which is a historian's happiest circumstance. So thank you.